it's a very enriching book, and I recommend it to anybody. I had a great time reading it. I think I read it in like 2 days because it was just so compelling. So it's a great pleasure for me, Mr. Gary Gibson, to present Mr. Brett Hetherington.
Thank you, Mr. Gary Gibson. Gary made a little crap about Australia, which we accept as Australians. My wife Paula here in Australia, and my son, technically Australian also. We accept these cracks from people from Carlisle in England. Gary's a very nice guy for an academic. There's my little crack at Gary. But look, thanks very much everyone for coming. It's great to see everybody here. I've had the chance already to speak to some people and meet some people who I've known or half known or some familiar faces, so that's great. I also want to thank Sergio for having me here. It's great to finally be able to present the book to a Barcelona audience, having lived here for quite some years, and this book was published just before the pandemic, so it was difficult to find the best place to present it, and the pandemic caused lots of problems, as we know. One of them was, a continual problem for businesses. And Sergio, also to you, congratulations on remodelling the shop. It's looking great, and I know you're doing well. And Sergio's a great supporter of local authors, and does regular presentations here with other authors. So maybe for tonight, this may not be the only time you come back here. There's lots of other good Spanish Catalan writers who are here presenting works. 1 month from now, less than a month, some people who live in this country are going to vote in the Spanish national elections. You might notice I'm wearing a purple ribbon, which I sometimes do, in support of women's rights here. 1 month from now, there could well be a new government. If there is a new government, that's likely to be not only a conservative government, but a government which is going to include the extreme right. What that will mean for women's rights, for minorities' rights, for people who have a non-heterosexual sexuality, I am very worried about. So this new government, this possible new government, is also a possible danger. And people who live lives here in this country that are not the ideal life according to conservatives and ultra-conservatives could be in for a very, very difficult time in the future. I wanted to start a reading from the book with one of those types of people. This is in Merida in Extremadura. I met this man on the street. The museum closed for lunch. On my way to find somewhere to eat, a street away from my hotel, I noticed a man opening up the lid on one of the big green rubbish hoppers that can be found on most Spanish streets. He was pushing a shopping trolley with a few items in it, a couple of strips of twisted metal, and some other bits and pieces which I would think of as junk. I had seen many people doing exactly the same since the economic crisis, the so-called economic crisis, which in reality was a banking crisis. Since that began in 2008, most of these people were Africans, with or without papeles, government registration. But more recently, it was apparent that not only hard-up migrants were turning to what Americans call dumpster diving. I told this man, who in 30+ degree heat was wearing a jumper, sweating, that I was a journalist and would pay him €3 for 10 minutes of his time if he talked to me. He gave me a sideways glance, but shook my hand when I offered the money. noticeably thin and giving off an unpleasantly strong body odour, it has to be said. I asked him what he was doing. Was he collecting something? Yes, he said confidently, but with a hint of defensiveness. I get anything that I can and sell it and take it to the chatarreria, the scrapyard. That's what I do every day. I've done it for 3 hours today, and next I'll go to the other part of town, into the industrial area, and see what I can find there. How long have you been doing this for? Most of my life. Do you have a family? I have 3 kids who go to school and a wife who works a bit. And do you have a house? Oh yes, so I pay rent. It's controlled by La Junta, the Extremadura regional government. And I don't take drugs, you know. I drink 1 beer a day and smoke tobacco. That's all. It was only now that he looked me in the eye. Okay then. And do the people of this town, how are they with you? Do they treat you well? Yeah, fine. Most people ignore me, and some offer to buy bread. A few tell me to go and look in other places, but I don't have any trouble. I was born here. I went to school until halfway through secondary school, but now I don't like sitting at home on the sofa. We have to live, right? I agreed and saw that he was wearing a wristband with the Spanish flag on it. So I asked him if he thought Spain is still a good country to live in. Of course, he said firmly. I would never repudiate my homeland. Here, I can work for myself because I don't have a boss. So this man, who it would be easy to see as a victim of the so-called economic crisis continuing, didn't think of himself that way at all. He found dignity in what he did, and his physical energy and drive were keeping him and his family going. When I offered him the money, I promised he declined it, and when I then said I would buy him some food if he told me he didn't need it at the moment. After we shook hands again, he went on his way, and we both went on our way. I met numerous people like this man during my travels, and I think one of the beauties of travelling is it opens up your perception to what is around you, and you probably have conversations with those people who you might not normally have a conversation with near where you live. That's only one example that's in the book. One of the reviewers on Amazon said that a major part of the book was the author talking to disenfranchised people. And it is a part of the book. I don't know if it's a major part of the book, but it is a part of what I wrote. Okay. Something a little bit lighter as another part of my experience. I was on a train, as I was regularly during this trip of the interior of Spain especially. By the way, the book is called Unsung Spain because I think the parts that I visited were intentionally the parts that are not well promoted, not well known by foreign tourists or even some foreign residents. And those places included Zaragoza and Extremadura, for example. Here I was on the way to Zaragoza on the train. Okay. I got on this train. But 5 minutes into the trip, mild level violence was a distinct possibility. Sitting directly behind me were a young boy and a girl who continued to kick my seat. I could tell they were brother and sister by the way they set up a repetitive pattern of needling each other. The boy told the grandmother he wanted to go to the beach today, but his sister kept stirring him by saying they'd be going tomorrow. Oi, mañana, oi, mañana, oi, mañana, oi, mañana. Shut up, the grandmother said quietly. Oi, mañana, oi, mañana, oi, mañana, oi, mañana. The verbal tennis went on for a full 5 minutes. It was loud enough to be difficult to ignore, but as was standard for this country, it seemed to me, the other passengers just half looked on with indulgent smiles. Not a word of complaint was uttered, although some of them, the passengers, were clearly watching this little Abbott and Costello routine more closely. Oi manana, oi manana, oi manana, oi, slap! It seemed like the grandmother had reached the limit of her patience, but I could hear her laughing as she hit one of them. She had struck out while barely interrupting her conversation with a person across the aisle from her. The kid began to cry. This could be the kind of drudgery that might lead you to think twice about travelling in Europe in August. But because it was Spain, the atmosphere was not tense. My thoughts of saying something to the kids did not last, and the grandmother's handiwork was more of a surprise for her grandson than a blow that physically hurt him. To me, though, it was a lazy and contemptible act. And then in the next section, I talk about the figure of the abuela, the grandmother, and the grandmother's importance in Mediterranean society, not only Spain and Catalonia, but in Mediterranean Europe, and especially my explanation of how I think society would collapse here without the grandmothers, without las abuelas. I could read another section, or I could take some questions. I prefer the question and answer methodology myself, but if there are no questions or you run out of questions, I'll do a little bit more reading. But yes, I invite questions. Do you have any questions? Yes, thank you. Please. What's your name?
Michelle.
Michelle. Hi, Michelle.
Hi.
Please
Which
go.
countries, which cities did you travel to that were very remote?
Well, I wouldn't necessarily say remote. I mean, Extremadura, certainly.
That's the border with Portugal, right?
Yes, correct. Yes, the border, with Portugal. Yeah, that region. I mean, the word remote is often used. I mean, I come from Australia, and remote has a different meaning there, where you can drive for days and see no one. So remote is a relative thing, but obviously parts of Extremadura, which at times reminded me of some of the landscapes in Australia. Remote, I can see why remote, that word is applied to Extremadura. So that was probably the most remote place. I went to a couple of towns in Extremadura. Yes. Thanks for the question.
I was interested in the way
Who's this academic? Sorry.
I'm the English on the phone. I'm just thinking that you explained the difference between a traveller and a tourist in the book, which I found really interesting. How do you define the two?
I don't remember exactly how I defined them, but I suspect I said something like a tourist travels for sort of short-term fun, pleasure, not really taking much notice of what's around, and travels with expectation. You know, going to Disneyland. When I go to Disneyland, I expect this, this, and this. And if I don't get that, I'm going to be angry and I want my money back, maybe, or that's the kind of tourist mentality of you get what you pay for. You go, you leave quickly, and maybe excess alcohol or drugs is part of the experience of a tourist, part of some travellers too. Traveller, I think, travels typically with a more open mind and has the idea of experiencing the culture of the country, not just as it's presented in shows or in even in books. I mean, but has the idea that being open to whatever is around is how you best experience another country. Even if you have points on the itinerary and a list of things you want to do, just has a much more open mind, I think. Yeah.